Good morning, Dr. Michael Fisher. Going to be talking about a new term today called metra, and I'll start with some images before I dive into this lecture. It's a painting I did. That figure face I found in Greek sculpture art history. I was searching for philosophia, some kind of image, some kind of notion, and she capital H, her S, Sophia as representing that other side of the feminine of the philosophy. So philosophia rather than just philosophy. But Sophia, as you can see, is in the word philosophy. So today is a lecture talk on philosophy from a very different perspective. It's going to be a philosophia perspective, a feminine perspective, as some people might call. Some would say, well, it's womanist. Some would say it's feminist. All of those terms that I've just mentioned are going to be challenged and they're going to be nuanced in this talk because I'm actually trying to get to something a little different than that. Let me give you a few other images and we'll get to again coming back to metra, metra, as a prefix and what it means and what you can attach it to create a whole different philosophy, a whole different psychology. And really a way of being and a way of healing, a way of transforming, a way of change, a way of dot, 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 dot. A few more images. Bracha L. Ettinger will be a part of this lecture, but not the focus. Just to let you know, this word matrixial subjectivity that you see at the top, matrixial aesthetics and ethics, which is a whole different metra approach to psychology and philosophy and art, etc. And this is the article I'm reading right now, The Matrix and Metamorphosis. It's from one of her articles she published in a journal. And this was back in, I think, 1989. She did her original writing. She's also an artist. That's why you can see the artwork mixing with psychology here with psychoanalysis. She is a psychoanalyst as well. That's a picture of her very early and young, but for 40 years, she has been articulating a theory of metra in her own way, and now called Ettingerian Matrixial theory. And lots of people are publishing, academics and otherwise practitioners are using matrixial theory after Ettinger. But again, that's not the focus of this talk. I'm going to explore a few other images and give you a bit more architecture for what I'm trying to build here. And the analogy is, if you want to hang in me for a while here, it's going to be you got to think in genre. So I like to think about music genres. So here's a grip for you to hold on to today as I come into this new architecture of this philosophia, the metra, and ultimately a new coining of metapsychology. All right, so genres are very interesting. If you were to look up an encyclopedia of musicology, for example, or even just popular literature on music, there are probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of around the world genres that have been named and coined. You know, we've got R&B and then you've got rock and roll, and these are all genres, but then they started hybridizing and then they start mixing, right? And then you get all these genres. Well, there's just so many. I mean, if you were looking at the history of music, and then again, people classify these things. Now, I'm not a musicologist, even though I am a musician. But I find the analogy interesting to apply to psychology. I have a very mixed relationship with psychology, a love hate, let's call it. But I'm very interested constantly to see if I can come up with a new piece of music, a new genre, a new writing, thinking being, a way to work the world of the psyche, let's call it, that is not just individual psychology, not just Freudian, not just Jungian, etc. So you see, there's a lot of genres in psychology, isn't there? And there's cognitive behaviorism, and there's Skinnerian, and there's etc. etc. So the genres in psychology are enormous as well, hundreds and hundreds of genres of types of psychology. So again, I'm just giving you an intro here to be aware of when you are looking for something psychological, written, researched, published, YouTube, whatever it is, a lecture you watch, be aware that you're dealing with genres of psychology, not just there's one psychology that has all the truth, just like not one music that captures all the richness and truths of the musical realm. There's a psychological realm with many genres. There's a musical realm with several genres. You get the idea. Let me go to a couple other pieces of architecture for you before I dive into more nuance and come back to notions of metapsychology. Again, this is all initial. This is like my first time speaking about this in public, even though I've had thoughts about this for probably 30 years. Okay, have a look at this. Talked about different spheres, right, of reality. And these are the common ones that are used by a lot of thinkers, philosophers, and they have quite a long traditionary in at least Western thought, which is where I will specialize in. I can't speak about a lot of the other cultures around the world with the expertise I can of the Western world. And it's certainly that you will see this out there. You may have even heard of these physiosphere being the sphere of planetary life existence that is involving the physiological dimensions, the materiality of the world. And then from that materiality, which often we call in natural sciences as non-living matter, they have the life biosphere. That's the sphere of life of all kinds, from the most primal to the most complex, which humans belong in the biosphere, but we also belong in the physiosphere. Our bodies are made of the same material of the earth and certainly the cosmos around us in some ways. Then there's the noosphere, and this is a complexity, right? Increasing complexity of spheres of reality. Yes, there is reality. And how do we get to know it? Well, we can classify it into spheres, study the spheres, try to interact the spheres. So noosphere represents the mind or consciousness sphere, right? More interior, less visible than the biosphere, and the physiosphere, which are very physical, easier to see, easier to touch, very empirical, easily to identify, study, measure. Noosphere gets very complicated to measure. Now we're really having difficulty. We have to measure consciousness. We have to measure and have theories about mind and how it works. It's psyche, right? Psychology, which is the talk today, is about that mind sphere at some level, but it's interacted with all of these spheres. And the theosphere is the last one, which would be the theory, the divine is another word, theos or theological sphere. It's above just mind, and it goes into what people often call spirituality, religion, those domains as well. The one that's missing from here, which I will be adding today in my new genre here, I'm creating a metrapsychology, is matrixial sphere. Matrixial, just how it sounds. Matrix, add the I-A-L, and you've got matrixial. So let me show that on one more card with two more terms. So there's the matrixial sphere. That's where I'm going right now. And somebody might ask, well, how is that different than what we have now about the spheres? Well, all of those spheres I just showed you on this card do not make any distinction between the phallic realm and the matrixial realm. So there's kind of a larger, you can call it meta realm going on that is not being distinguished in this typical classification system. And this is preferably not preferably, but it's the dominant way that we understand reality today. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't distinguish between the phallic realm, which is the more masculine, and the matrixial, which is the more feminine. But as soon as I bring up masculine and feminine, some people go, oh, now you're dividing males against females, women against men. No, I'm not. Matrixial theory and the the metrapsychology I'm going to be talking about today is pre-gender. It's pre-formation of gender per se as we understand it in most thinking and theorizing and writing and teaching today. It's proto-gendered. Yet it is also called feminine for a reason. We'll get to that slowly. And it will come back to Bracha L. Ettinger, the image I just showed you of this theorist, psychoanalyst, who has made, along with others, this huge distinction between matrixial sphere, metasphere really, and the phallic metasphere. So now let's diving in. You see, I'm diving into that more feminine matrixial sphere, and these are the two genres I'm interested in pulling out. Again, this is going to be Fisher's psychology in simple terms, Fisher's philosophy. Will it be useful for the future? Will it be useful for humanity? I would like to see that happen. But for now, you can make decisions whether you're interested more in this. We can explore that more, what readings would be helpful, etc. We'll go over that near the end of the talk today. Let's go to that first term because when I showed that article, Metramorphosis and the Matrix by Bracha Ettinger, that's new book in 2020 she put. This comes from this essay, again, 1989 is when she started crafting that, Bracha Ettinger. And that essay, I'm just studying in fine detail. I barely can read like one sentence and then it just throws me into a huge bunch of thinking. I don't know if you've got a mind like that, but it's like I can just go so deep in so many directions so quickly. Part of it is just because I've been a nerdy study type thinker for a long time. And metamorphosis is a term she has come up with, that as far as I know. And it's very interesting because it's got this phrase metra. Well, metra is really important to today. Metra, M-E-T-R-A, is the Latin root for uterus. Also womb, also matrix. Matrix has its Latin origins as womb space or womb-like or womb cave-like, etc. So you can do your own etymological search on those terms. But ma is mother. It's sort of a whole linguistic and a whole morphic field of the feminine that again is not just about being a woman, a girl, right? It's not about that versus male being a boy. See, that's a world of opposites, isn't it? Those gender categories tending to be very oppositional. And that's because we have a very dualistic world reality, worldview that keeps constructing that dualism. And so you can see the genre I'm working with in philosophy and psychology at this larger level of psychology. A meta psychology that is actually metrapsychology is now literally you could interpret metrapsychology as, again, not gendered, but difference, a jointness in difference, as Bracha Ettinger would say, that metra is a womb or uterine feminine psychology. Okay, might argue, and some people will immediately say, well, come on, Michael, who the hell do you think you are? You know, feminist psychology and feminist psychoanalysis, for example, has been around forever. Well, not forever, probably, 50, 60, 80 years. You can trace it back. Yeah, it has. I've looked at some of that. I am not an expert in it. I don't studied it in detail, but I'm looking at Bracha L. Ettinger And that's who I know most about because I've studied her with my wife and partner since 2010. Written articles published, talked to Bracha, had her in panels, etc. Bracha is a psychoanalyst and she knows all the psychoanalytical literature. She's a philosopher and she's an artist and a psychoanalyst. Like, what a combination. She's amazing. She's an activist. And she is, more or less said, well, all of those psychologies, you know, Freud upward in psychoanalysis at least, which is her sort of specialty, are inadequate toward the feminine. And that was continually her argument. And not surprisingly, she's not only an woman artist, she's a woman mother. She has a woman's sensibility, you could argue. But again, that's because in her argument, metramorphosis is different than metamorphosis. We're all used to metamorphosis, caterpillar to the butterfly. She came along and said, well, I don't think that's how humans develop. I don't think that's how the psyche develops. She said, I think there's a process called metramorphosis. And that's a very long, complicated, but basically the explanation, or in simple terms, is metramorphosis and metrapsychology, which I'm putting out as a coined genre today. Metramorphosis is the forming, the morphosis, the shaping, based on the uterus, metra, the womb. And you can add to that philosophia. See, it's a sphere, it's a sensibility, it has a language of its own, and Bracha has spent 40 years developing a very unique vocabulary that is a little tough to get into, you bet it is, and it's not just a little tough. So I've started since 2010, 15 years of studying, my wife and I, and we still feel like we're still babies, still trying to learn this language and what it means. So that's what I'm doing today. I'm kind of crawling around like a baby here in front of you. And I'm trying to articulate a new psychology, a new genre. Again, like in music, when a new genre comes along, it doesn't replace and destroy all the other genres and say, well, nothing else matters in the other genres. In fact, everybody's learning from everybody, right? Every genre at some level, if it's in contact, is going to influence each other and hybridize in some way, even though there'll be a new emergent set. Somebody will coin, wow, this is a new genre I'm working with. Yeah, well, that happens. That's how evolution works. It integrates and then it transcends and goes to a new differentiation, but always connected, always has a history, right? Always connected to its past. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm not some kind of radical thinks this is brand new and all the rest is crap. That's a typical, very immature anarchistic point of view, and an anarchistic psychology point of view of not the best kind of anarchism. Matrixial is this feminine sphere. And why is that coming back? It's coming back now with Bracha Ettinger's work. She's one of the leading thinkers in this metro world of metamorphosis. And you won't find that word around. You can look it up. It's not out there hardly at all. And there's no such term as metrapsychology. But there's a lot of people theorizing about the womb and the uterus and the feminine. And yes, real women's bodies. And so Bracha Ettinger is not going to ignore that women's bodies are different with the uterus. And therefore, some people critique that as essentialist and so on. That's a whole other larger topic. I will be glad to walk you through that. You can read Ettinger and her critiques of those critiques. But Ettinger has been a lot of deep thought for 40 years, and that means this is not a superficial psychology. This is not a pop psychology. This is not a humanistic, simple psychology of human potential. But yes, it is challenging the over phallic, the over masculinized, again, to use that word in the largest sense, not just gender, but an approach. Some people would say Bracha Ettinger's, I would say, is more right brain, less left hemisphere brain dominated. A lot of people are talking about that in neurobiology to philosophy. psychology. We have to get back that right brain functioning, that artistic functioning, that aesthetic, affective. So these are all terms I'm giving you, terms that would be really important, you know, not not to be over dominating of the phallic sphere. She says and argues they are complementary spheres. Phallic sphere is much more the symbolic sphere. That's when language and symbol, metaphor, story become so important. But there's this whole body, sensory, somatic realm of knowing, affective, before even the cognitive gets established very far. That domain, that really blood and flesh and touch and taste of the sensory, and this is for all organisms. This is a realm that all organisms have in the earth, the matter, the earth mattered. We are earth mattering beings, is another way you could think of. And that can affect your spirituality. I'm an earth spirituality based, individual. I've chosen that earth path, the mother path, the feminine path, right? The matrixial path. So matrixial is a really good word. And then you add the metra to it, and you start to say, well, what is different between metramorphosis and metamorphosis? Metamorphosis is not about the phallic sphere or about the distinction with the phallic sphere and the power dynamic that's been set up where one dominates so much over the other, at least in a long period of time, perhaps thousands of years, that's been the case. So we're trying to recover the matrixial now sphere. So metamorphosis, this very basic biological term, does not engage, right? It does not engage that kind of deeper political, philosophical, psychological dynamic of what Ettinger, for example, is raising to the surface, as some many others have, and which I will and continue to do in my critical psychology development. Theorizing right down to practices. How do we have matrixial practices? So metamorphosis is, as she says, is predictable. That is not the human, there's less in the human experience and biology, etc., that's pretty predictable. If you mate with a male and a female, you will get an offspring, more or less. So, not about no predictability, but it's about really opening up metramorphosis, as that's probably what's going on. And what she talks about, metramorphosis, metra, is all of what has to do that's much more unpredictable, but much more dynamic, and this interacting of what she calls psyches, or you could even call them souls, but she doesn't go there too often. She can use that language at times, of subjectivities of the I and the non-I. In other words, the self and the other would be another way to language that distinction, which is very real for most of us, but that is a very complex dynamic as well, right? The self and the other relation. So in some way, that's always playing, except in the very early stages, in the uterus, in the womb, where matrixial thinking and aesthetics and ethics is actually working out. It's like proto ethical, it's proto psychological, it's proto self, and a regular conscious self of itself, knowing it's different than the outside, is not in the womb experience very much, if at all, only in the later stages, perhaps in a very proto subjective way. So it's also, this is all talk about the relationship of subject to the object, how we, work that relationship out, and it creates a psychology. So in a way, you could say this is about a womb metra, right? Uterine psychology. We're interested. And it's a psychology that influences and ought to influence all psychology, just like the phallic sphere, in the way Freud developed, particularly most of the psychodynamic world of the psyche based on the Oedipal complex, the phallic cut, and so on and so on. This very masculine way, and the feminine was always secondary, if not pathological. The womb became a hysteric place of hysteria, and the women became irrational, and the body became irrational of women and birth. Well, all this is being challenged, as you know, if you're paying any attention to many birthers, natalists, and certainly people who are caring about the woman's body and its rights and its gifts to a different kind of way of being in the world. We need to pay attention to women. Okay, so again, that's like really blunt, right? But you have to so that that doesn't become pathological. In other words, putting women up and men down, or the masculine up and feminine down. That's what we're trying to get around here. That's what I'm trying to develop, a genre of psychology that doesn't fall into that. And you have to move to this meta level, which is a psychology of psychologies. And then you have to move, I argue, another genre, which is metrapsychology. And that pulls back this Ettingerian notion of metramorphosis, which is all the reactions, all the interactions, metramorphosis in the matrixial border space. The border space between the I and the non-I, the self and the other, the subject and the object. That's a lot I've thrown out at you in a very short time. I trust some of these images might be useful that I've thrown up as well to let you know it's not all just rational talk. That's why I'm using art. That's why Bracha Ettinger developed her theory of the Matrixial and of metamorphosis as the most basic process. And she said, metamorphosis, way too simplified. It's not what humans go through. They do in a certain way, but you got to look at metramorphosis in these border spaces of the subtle, much more nuanced, much better term, much more real, everything I've read and looked at. And I could do a whole talk, we could do a whole course on metramorphosis itself. And why is that different and needed beyond this idea of metamorphosis as a model, right? As a metaphor for human development, growth and change, transformation. Very inadequate. Metamorphosis is. We could do a whole course on this, just metramorphosis. And I can't even teach that right now because I don't have the grasp of it the way I would like to. I'm getting there. And again, over 15 years, I'm starting to get a good feel for it. And not just as intellectual, but as practice and as expression, right? As this aesthetic kind of art would reflect that metra psychology, metramorphosis. What kind of plays, dramas? So arts are really important in this theory. She is an artist, and that's where she developed her original thinking. She's a painter, primarily. That's where she had these deep, deep, I would call mystical, and she sometimes will refer to them as mystical, but she doesn't promote that and make a big deal of it. She was analyzing it as an artist, philosopher, thinker, theorist. And then she said, oh, the way I relate to my painting, she's a very established, very international. You can look up her art, Bracha L. Ettinger's art. She says that relationship is very similar to how I work in the psychoanalytic with the psychoanalyst and the analysand and the analyst. And all her years of working in that and training. And she said, there's something there. They're the same because we're working with the self and the other, the I and the non-I. I'm not the same as my client, right? I'm an analyst. That was her position there. I'm an artist, but I'm working with this art, and we're not the same. But this intimacy, this is the matrixial intimacy, if you will, the metra intimacy, the metrapsychology of relationality. Why am I talking about anything of this today? Why would I do this in a world that we're so troubled today, so in crisis, is because we have a crisis of relationship. And until we get this relational psychology, and we have lots of great thinkers about relational psychologies and philosophies and thinking, sociology, all the disciplines that have been interested in improving relations on this planet, not just human to human, right? Human to non-human, so-called, or more than human, or greater than human, as some people say. This is where the indigenous perspective is coming back. I'm interested in the indigenous perspective plus the Ettingerian perspective and other psychologies, genres to come up, and I will be synthesizing those over the years um, into this metrapsychology. All right, I think that's lots. Yeah, just gonna look at my notes here if I have anything on the side. I didn't follow my notes, but it's probably just lots. Look forward to you commenting on and asking questions, pulling me out. If you have things to correct in what I've said, um, look for your corrections as well. Very humbled to be doing this work and going through this raw process with you. I know most people don't do a video until they're all, got it all clear what they're going to say. Um, that's not matrixial processing and thinking. Yeah, you can be really clear and be really rational in matrixial thinking too. Matrixial consciousness, if you will, or metramorphic consciousness. That's another term that Bracha uses in this article, and I just want to understand that. Metramorphic consciousness. Just different. It's hugely similar and it's just very creative. I just feel like it's opening doors and thoughts. And I would like that to happen for other people. If you're feeling like the psychologies we have today are sort of inadequate, and I'm talking all the way from Buddhist psychology to the newest, AI psychology theorists and so on. But they're all doing their work. I'm going to be working on my genre, and other people can play their genre of psychologies, and you'll decide which one you want to utilize and or even create your own. Okay, thanks for this today, and let's stay thinking metra for a while is my challenge. What would that mean? And again, males, this is not a threat to you. This is not about you. You know why? Because you are womb-based. You are uterus-based. You came out of the womb just like everybody. No more, no less. See, this gets around the gender domination, subordination, psychology, dualism that is polarization that's just killing this planet. There's way, there's other ways. So this is my genre. This is my small effort. Thanks.